Through the kitchen window, I spotted the dust rising before I saw the machines. 3 excavators stood idling just feet away from my ripening vineyard, engines rumbling, shovels raised, like executioners waiting for a signal. And I stood frozen, breath locked in my chest. Before I tell you what happened when the sheriff read my deed, stay with me till the end. It was late July, and the summer sun poured golden light over the vineyard like syrup. My rows of vines had never looked more alive, taut with fruit, green and glistening, almost humming in the heat. This wasn't just land to me. It was the dream I had bought with 5 years of labor and sacrifice. Every inch of soil had passed through my hands. Every wire, every stake, every sprouting leaf, planted, trimmed, and prayed over. Over the past few weeks, I had noticed unusual activity near the boundary line. Surveyor flags popped up where there had never been any. A few trucks rolled through the neighboring development, which had recently become part of a growing HOA. I kept my head down, assuming their work didn't concern me. My property sat just beyond their gate, outside their jurisdiction, or so I believed. But last night, something changed. I saw faint white lines chalked across my southern fence, markers for digging. Not theirs. Mine. Morning came, and so did the noise. I stepped outside to a low mechanical growl echoing through the field. That's when I saw them, 3 full-size excavators stationed just beyond the first row of vines. 5 men in red HOA vests stood nearby, holding clipboards and talking in clipped tones. I rushed over, boots half-laced, adrenaline rushing. "What is this?" I shouted. One of them barely looked up. "Routine clearing. This area falls under HOA maintenance. We're removing unauthorized planting." Unauthorized? I stared at the man like he'd lost his mind. "This is my land," I said, pointing to the ground under my feet. "I own it. I have the deed." But he shrugged, unfazed. "As of last month, your parcel was included in an updated service map. You've been notified." I hadn't. No mail. No email. No knocks. Just machines aimed at my vines. And a smirk from a clipboard-wielding stranger. I ran inside and grabbed my property folder, the thick file I kept tucked in a drawer for emergencies. Title report, county deed, survey maps, HOA exclusion letter from when I bought the place. My land had always been outside any homeowners association. That was the whole point. I paid more for that freedom. I returned, documents in hand, and dialed the sheriff's office. "They're threatening to dig into my vineyard," I told the dispatcher. "I need someone here now." To their credit, the sheriff's department moved fast. A patrol SUV rolled up within 15 minutes, lights flashing but siren off. A tall, quiet deputy stepped out, took one look at the scene, and approached the HOA men calmly. He asked for their work order. One of them handed over a folder, almost bored. The deputy flipped through it, nodded, then walked over to me. "Do you have documentation?" I handed him everything. He sat in his cruiser for nearly 10 minutes reviewing my papers, occasionally glancing out the window toward the machines. I watched from the side, heart hammering, wondering if he'd side with them, if paperwork even mattered anymore. Then the engine cut. The deputy stepped out and motioned to the crew. "Shut it all down," he said firmly. Immediately. The effect was instant. Shovels lowered. Engines died. Dust settled. And faces turned pale. I could see it now, the realization dawning on the men who had arrived so confident, so entitled. The deputy explained, without raising his voice, that according to county land records and the original subdivision plan, my parcel was legally excluded from the HOA. Their updated service map held no legal power over deeded property lines. In simpler words, they were trespassing. And worse, attempting to destroy private agricultural property. Their supervisor began to protest, but the deputy shut it down. "If you touch one vine," he said, "you're looking at criminal charges." The men stepped back. I exhaled for what felt like the first time all morning. The vineyard, my quiet pride and joy, was still intact, but barely. Later that afternoon, I discovered this wasn't an isolated incident. The HOA, facing budget shortfalls and declining membership, had quietly redrawn their boundary lines and started claiming external properties for maintenance fees, and in my case, land control. It was a power play, a financial move disguised as civic upkeep. But they picked the wrong person this time. Because I wasn't going to let it go. Not after what I saw in their eyes when the sheriff held up that deed. A week passed in tense silence. The excavators never returned, but the damage, emotional, not physical, lingered like a bruise beneath the skin. Every morning, I walked the edge of my vineyard, inspecting the vines like a sentry guarding a battlefield. The fear wasn't just about machines anymore, it was about trust. If they had the nerve to come once, what would stop them again? Then came the letter. A thick envelope marked Official HOA Correspondence sat in my mailbox like a threat disguised in formality. I opened it on the porch. Inside were 2 pages. The first was a formal notice of jurisdiction expansion, stating that my property now benefited from HOA community services and was therefore subject to fees and oversight. The second was an invoice, $2,440 due immediately, with late fees accruing after 15 days. My jaw tightened. They hadn't learned. They were doubling down. I took the letter to my attorney. He read it once, then again more slowly, his fingers tightening around the edge of the paper. "They're testing you," he said. "They know the sheriff didn't file a formal injunction. They're hoping paperwork will scare you into compliance." But I wasn't afraid. I was angry. This was my land. My dream. And now it was being hunted by bureaucracy dressed up as community management. We filed a formal cease and desist with the county. Alongside it, we submitted a legal challenge to the HOA's expansion map, citing multiple boundary violations and a failure to disclose changes to affected property owners. Then we did one better. We contacted the county zoning board and requested a full review of the HOA's expansion documents. It turned out they had never filed them properly. No hearing. No public notice. No legal legitimacy. By the time the county started asking questions, the HOA board went quiet. I noticed fewer red vests walking the streets. The usual patrol truck that cruised past my fence every evening vanished. But I wasn't relaxing. I was preparing. We collected everything: photos, letters, maps, surveillance footage of the excavators, statements from the sheriff. I kept it all in a binder labeled Vineyard Invasion. I was ready to go to war. Then, almost like clockwork, they made their final move. I received a civil summons. The HOA was suing me for non-compliance with neighborhood guidelines, citing landscaping violations, community disruption, and failure to pay dues. I sat in my chair, stunned. They were taking me to court over a vineyard I planted 5 years before they even existed. Court day arrived with an overcast sky and a courtroom that smelled like polished wood and stale air. I wore the same boots I wore when I stood in front of those excavators. The judge, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and no patience for games, asked the HOA's attorney to present their case. He spoke in long, sweeping phrases about community standards, maintenance obligations, and collective harmony. Then it was my turn. My lawyer stood and handed the judge a single document, my original deed, stamped and recorded, explicitly stating that the property was purchased outside any HOA jurisdiction. Then he handed over the letter from the zoning board confirming that the HOA's boundary expansion was invalid. And finally, the photo of the excavators lined up like predators on my land. He didn't need to say much. The evidence did the speaking. The judge leaned back, took a long breath, and said the words I'll never forget: "This is not a valid claim. Case dismissed." She paused, then added, "Mr. Barrett, you may proceed with any counterclaims as you see fit." I almost didn't hear the last part. My ears were ringing with the sound of victory. Back home, the vines were just beginning to turn, deep red and gold, heavy with promise. I walked between the rows and felt the soil under my feet like a heartbeat. They had tried to erase what I'd built. They thought they could redraw lines and bully me into silence. But I was still standing. And now, they were the ones on defense. The week after the court dismissal felt like sunlight after a long, bitter storm. But I wasn't celebrating. Not yet. The real battle was only beginning. The judge had opened the door for me to file a counterclaim, and I intended to walk through it with everything I had. They didn't just threaten my land. They tried to humiliate me, invade me, rob me in daylight. I wanted accountability. And now, I had legal standing to demand it. My attorney filed the counter-lawsuit within 48 hours. It included counts for trespassing, attempted property damage, harassment, emotional distress, and malicious litigation. But the part that stung them the most was our request for punitive damages. We weren't just asking for compensation. We were accusing them of knowingly abusing power for financial gain. And we had evidence. Their attorney responded with a bland, generic denial. No apology, no explanation, just a refusal to accept wrongdoing. But while they were stalling, we were digging. Through public records, we discovered that their HOA board hadn't held a valid community vote in over 2 years. Several members were serving past expired terms. Worse, their operating funds, nearly $180,000, had dwindled to less than $30,000. Their finances were bleeding. That's why they were desperate. That's why they came for me. I learned that I wasn't the only one. 2 other property owners, families whose lots bordered the HOA, had received similar expansion letters and invoices, but they'd paid them in fear, unsure of their rights. One of them, an elderly couple, thought it was a city tax and wrote a check without question. When they found out the truth, they were heartbroken and ready to fight back. With their statements, our case grew stronger. The court date for the countersuit was set for late September. In the weeks leading up to it, I returned to the vineyard often, not just to tend the vines, but to breathe. The quiet rose reminded me what I was defending. Not just land. Not just grapes. But peace. Independence. The right to own something fully without permission from a board, a bylaw, or a gatekeeper with a clipboard. On the morning of the trial, the courtroom buzzed with more spectators than I expected. Local reporters had caught wind of the case. Homeowner fights back against rogue HOA, read the headline online. I didn't care about attention. I cared about the truth being known. The HOA's representatives looked smaller now, more hesitant. Their board president, a man who once tried to have me cited for land misuse, avoided eye contact the entire time. Our presentation was clean. My lawyer spoke plainly, backed by timelines, photos, testimonies, and public record. The HOA's strategy, on the other hand, was muddy. They tried to argue that expansion rights were implied in their charter, but when the judge asked for proof of resident voting, their faces dropped. They had none. Their actions had no legal foundation. It was like watching a cracked dam break in slow motion. The verdict didn't come that day. It came 3 days later, and with it, a quiet kind of thunder. The court ruled fully in my favor. The HOA was ordered to pay full restitution for legal costs, $25,000 in damages for emotional and property distress, and issue public letters of apology to me and the other 2 affected homeowners. But what shook them wasn't the money. It was the judge's final note, a recommendation that the county audit the HOA's operations for broader misconduct. By October, the HOA was imploding. Several board members resigned. The treasurer disappeared. Emails leaked. And slowly, the community that once used intimidation as policy began to turn on itself. Residents demanded answers, audits, votes. The same power they had tried to wield against outsiders, now turned inward. I watched from my porch, coffee in hand, as their once proud patrol truck was towed away, unpaid lease, the rumor said. I didn't feel joy. I felt justice. Quiet. Firm. Final. They tried to bury me in paperwork and noise. But I planted roots deeper than they ever understood. Fall arrived like a silent reward. The vineyard, untouched and thriving, reached its final phase of ripening. Every step through the rows brought with it a subtle crunch of dry leaves and the sharp sweet scent of full-grown grapes hanging heavy on the vines. I had always dreamed of harvesting with peace in my chest, not pressure, not fear. And this year, I finally had that. The news about the HOA spread wider than I imagined. Local newspapers ran the story. A podcast reached out. Even the county commissioner's office requested a summary of the legal proceedings. But I wasn't interested in fame. I turned them down politely. This was never about going viral. It was about standing your ground when the world tells you to sit down. About proving that ordinary people with limited means still had something more powerful, the truth. From afar, I watched the neighborhood change. The HOA that once acted like a fortress was now exposed like a hollow shell. Their community meetings became battlegrounds of accountability. Homeowners demanded budgets, elections, clarity. No more blind trust. No more silence. The new president was a retired schoolteacher, calm, honest, and painfully aware of the mess she'd inherited. She sent me a letter, handwritten. It didn't ask for forgiveness, but it acknowledged the harm and thanked me for standing up. I framed it and kept it in my home office. The couple who had paid the fraudulent dues eventually got their money back through small claims court. I testified on their behalf. When the ruling came, they both cried outside the courthouse, not because of the money, but because someone had finally listened. The man hugged me and whispered, "You didn't just save your vines. You saved us too." I'll never forget that. Harvest day came with an early fog that burned off by mid-morning. I hired a few neighbors to help. Hands that once waved from across the road now held baskets and clippers, moving with care. We worked in silence mostly, except for the occasional laugh or shared memory. As crates filled with deep purple fruit, I realized I wasn't just collecting grapes, I was gathering the reward of resilience. Later that afternoon, I stood alone in the vineyard center, the sun dipping low and golden. This patch of land had tried to be stolen from me. Not with weapons, but with signatures. Not with guns, but with letters. But I held it, defended it. And now it stood here, not just alive, but defiant, thriving. It reminded me of something I'd once heard: they tried to bury us. They didn't know we were seeds. My attorney called that evening with one last piece of news. The county audit had concluded. The HOA's mismanagement had been worse than suspected. Unauthorized bank withdrawals, forged minutes, and illegal code enforcement actions. The state had been notified. The HOA faced dissolution unless a complete restructure occurred. I nodded slowly as he spoke. It didn't surprise me. Some structures look strong, until the first crack reveals how hollow they truly are. I went inside, poured a glass from last year's barrel, and sat on the porch. Everything was quiet now. The machines were gone. The letters had stopped. The fear was over. And in that stillness, I found a kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. Not just for surviving it, but for refusing to be erased. In the end, they wrote my name on their map. But it was my land that wrote the ending.